All right, let's go ahead and talk about domain of a piecewise function. Now, the first thing we have to understand is that the domain right here is just simply saying, what are the x values? So what are the x values that create the graph? Okay. And we can identify this just by simply tracing the graph. So the first thing I do when I talk about domain is I do look at, since I'm looking at the x values, I'm going to put a negative infinity way out here and a positive infinity way up there. And that just tells us that the domain could reach very, very low or reach very, very high. Now, remember, we read a graph from left to right. And as we do the domain, we're just looking for x values that have graph under it. So if I was to trace this graph, you'll notice that there's an arrow right there. If I was to trace this graph, that arrow indicates that it would continue to go down and it would not stop. And what that means is simply from negative infinity, it is going to continue to make the graph all the way out as this thing drops. So we're going to start down at negative infinity. We're going to work our way in towards the right. And as soon as we get to this value at, it looks to be -3, it is going to stop. And I'm going to put a bracket there. And you'll notice that we have open circles, which means undefined values. And then, of course, we have values that just end without an open circle, and that is defined, meaning that there is an answer there. Now, so when we write our domain, we're going to say, well, we start at negative infinity, we go all the way to 3 brackets. So the first part of this domain is that negative infinity to -3. We open up a parentheses because negative infinity is unincluded because we're not exactly sure what that number is. It's not a finite number. Okay, and then we stop at -3. Now, when we continue the domain, you'll notice that right here to here, there is no graph above or below it. There's no graph this way, and there's no graph this way. So that is a split in our domain. And what you should see is that it picks up right here again at the value of 2, except this time it is undefined, and it's undefined because there is an open circle. Now, as we go this way, you'll notice that there's graph above it. So we just keep working, we keep working. All of these x values are creating graph, okay? And then we get to 2, and there's an open circle. Well, at 2, it doesn't create graph anymore. So I'm going to leave an open circle or an open parenthesis, and I'm going to say, okay, well, from there, what do we have? We have from -2, that's what that number was right there, all the way to this number right here, which is +2, okay, we have open graph. So I'm going to say, so far the domain is negative infinity, -3, then there is a gap, and that's that U there, that or symbol. And then we're going to go -2 all the way to +2. There's going to be graph above that section. And then we have to go and we have to look, okay, is there another gap? Well, check it out. From here until here, there's no graph. There is no graph. Okay, so there is what we'd consider a gap. So I'm going to put an or statement right here because there is no graph. And I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to say, okay, well, this is included. So I'm going to put a bracket. And notice that bracket's going to start there at the value of 3. And I'm going to work my way left to right again. And you'll notice that there's graph. I keep scribbling. There's more graph. I keep going. There's more graph. Okay, and then I keep going. There's more graph. And we come across this arrow that means it's just going to keep shooting up until we get to infinity, or it keeps going to infinity because it's not going to stop. So our domain will go all the way out to infinity with parentheses. So we have 3 parts to this domain. We go from negative infinity to -3 on the x-axis. We pick back up at -2. We go to 2, and then we pick back up at 3, and we go to infinity. Remember, brackets are when it's included. Parentheses are when it's not included. That has to deal with equals and not equals to. All right, that's the domain of just being given a graph.